Hello folks, I'm Peter Cowin, the Bee Whisperer, and I'm going to do a series of videos talking about my own kind of beekeeping, what I do, and I'm going to tell you both the way I manage bees, but also from the perspective of number one, I'm hoping to help out people who are thinking about becoming beekeepers or who are just starting out to become beekeepers. Go through some of the basics, describe some of the basic tools, the equipment, the bees, and also look at the possibility of if you're interested in taking beekeeping on to the next level and making it a bit of a sideline for you, something that actually earns some money. I've kept bees since I was 11, back in the 70s. And keeping bees has always been a hobby to me, a real stress buster, a lot of fun. Love to just get into the beehive. I think that every animal I've owned has always had babies, so I've always been into zoology. And I've had something to do with animals in just about everything that I've done in my professional life. But about 10 years ago, it became necessary for me to look at my hobby of beekeeping and say, can I make this earn a bit of money for me, because finances were really difficult and needed to take beekeeping on to the next level. At that stage, I had about 3 or 4 hives every year. And so my hobby started taking on a more serious component to it. So I'll be talking to you through a series of videos of ways in which I increased my beekeeping and made what is now for me a nice living, caring for bees, selling the bee products, selling bees, and various aspects that you could turn beekeeping into a nice little business. Now, this won't be something that everybody wants to do, but there's aspects of it that it's always nice to have a hobby that kind of pays for itself, as opposed to throwing money at it and losing money. I think that basically within a couple of years, there's no reason why you couldn't have had your investment not only pay for itself, but be making a reasonable profit, a reasonable return on what you put into it. And if you want to, you could make quite a substantial return on what you put into it. So I'm going to start off basically telling you a bit about the basic equipment. So let's start there. This is your typical Langstroth hive. It's the most common beehive, certainly in North America, possibly the world. The structure starts at the top, a telescopic cover that's clad in metal, and it will shed the rain and that sort of thing from the hive, keep it weatherproof. Normally you would paint a hive to make it more durable in the winter, so the wood will last. This is the inner cover. It's almost always, it's got a hole in the top here and a notch in the top for ventilation. I use an inner cover for a variety of different purposes. Its actual structure isn't critical, but the most common arrangement is an inner cover will be just underneath your telescopic cover, providing a secondary barrier from the elements. Now inside each of this box here, we would call this a hive body. I'd also refer to them as deep supers. So any of these boxes are referred to as deep supers. So this single-story hive has got frames in it, like these. There's a variety of new and used ones here. I'm going to show you how that's developed. Inside each frame, it's 4 pieces of wood, in this case stapled together, and then there's a piece of foundation in there for the bees to build their combs on. Now, foundation can come in a variety of ways. I use plastic foundation, but you can also use wax foundation. So here's a piece of wax foundation with wire reinforcements on it. So this piece of wax is very delicate. The wire is used there to strengthen it, but it's the nearest to the natural beehive that we have, apart from letting the bees build their combs freestyle in the frames themselves. This way they get the bees to build their combs in the frame, and they're reasonably straight, reasonably durable. I prefer to use plastic foundation. This is basically the same thing, only it's much harder. It's been coated in beeswax. You can see a thick part of it here. It's all been coated in wax, and the bees will use this as the foundation to build their comb. So, frames with just foundation here. Let's look at a few that have been built out to some degree. Here's some foundation that's been drawn out to some extent. They built out the comb a little bit. That's the process called drawing out the comb. So just got started on this one. This is more completely done. Now in this case it's not a wooden frame, it's actually a plastic frame, and the foundation is built in as part of that frame. You'll see a variety of different frames, all do the same purpose, holding the foundation in place so the bees can draw out the comb and make a completed comb on that foundation. Now this comb is only being partially used. It's being used to hold honey. I can tell that because it's still very light in color. It's not being stained by having brood in there. Brood are the young bees. Here's a comb that's had some brood in. Now this comb had wax foundation as opposed to plastic foundation. So one of the downsides of wax foundation is bees will sometimes chew holes right through and make shortcuts through the comb like this. That's not a bad thing, but it does make for a much more delicate structure. You see the wires still holding it in place, so it's still pretty firm, but compared to the plastic foundation it's pretty delicate. But notice how dark these cells are all here. These are cells where brood has been reared. The queen has laid an egg and larval bees have grown in here, and that dark staining not just is partially it's pollen that's been tracked in by bees, pollen and propolis has been tracked in with all their little eggs, but it's also the darker it is, the more a larva has been grown in there. The larva, when it grows in the cell, leaves behind its pupal casing, and it leaves one layer every time a larva is reared in there. And eventually combs like this will go virtually black as more and more larvae have been raised in it. This comb has been used for quite a while. Comb's much darker, and so there have been a lot of bees reared in this comb, but it's still very good to use. And typically I would give a frame like this a good working life of, say, 3 years to 5 years. By the time you get up to 5 years, it's a good idea to start the comb off again, because basically the cell walls will get thicker. So if you see these ones here, cell walls getting very thick, and the things like pesticides and various miticides, various treatments and chemicals that the bees pick up during the course of their existence can get absorbed by the wax. And so it's a good idea after about 5 years to cull combs and additional combs. Excuse me. Hey, be quiet. I'm trying to do a video here, okay? Shush. So here we have 10 frame deep super. If I take this deep super off, you can see the bottom there. We're down now to the hive bottom board. I like to use screened bottom boards. You can have solid bottom boards or screened bottom boards. The screened bottom board is very useful in helping to control mites, and we'll talk about controlling mites a lot more later. There's a tray in here to keep the draft out, and basically these are made for me by a guy here locally in Maine, Peter Cowin. Does a great job for me. We've come up with a few unique designs for our own purposes here. But this is basically the hive stand. So this is what you'd typically start your hive with. A deep super. You'd stock your bees into this small structure. This bottom board, super, frames, foundation, inner cover, and telescopic cover. If you got them in my store, cost you $125. Now, you'll notice that this hive bottom board here is a groove at the bottom, and that's the entrance to the hive. We can also use a feeder, put a feeder in the entrance here. So the feeder is simply I use entrance feeders, but I also use a variety of other feeders. This is just trying to keep it simple for the sake of the video. This will hold 2 quarts of sugar syrup when we want to feed the bees. And when that's closed up and turned up, that'll fill this little well here with sugar syrup, which can then go into the entrance of the hive, and the bees can be feeding all day and all night, and very rapidly build up the combs. So they need to eat a lot of sugar syrup or honey or nectar in order to build all that wax. Now, as the colony grows, we'll put another box on. Here's another bleak box. Now, typically, I'm going to show you a whole different range of sizes of hive that I like to operate, but most people will grow their hives up to this stage so that they can do very well in environments like here in Maine. In Maine, we have really cold winters, and the most hives are grown up to a stage of this sort of size to get through the winter, where these combs are all built and full of honey, and this box is about half full of honey. A colony that's big like this will be very forgiving. A lot of things, it can cope with much more extremes of temperature, that sort of thing. But you'll see that I'm going to operate some of my hives with much smaller boxes. For a beginner, I would recommend that you aim for 2 deeps to start with, but we'll talk about different ways of doing it later. So 2 deeps like this is a good structure to aim for, to have ready for the winter time. But it doesn't stop there. If you stock your bees, say the beginning of May, by the end of May they could have had this box built. By most of the way through June, they could have this box built. So then we can have another structure up on top, called a smaller box we have for honey. And this is a medium super. It's only about 6 inches as opposed to 9 inches here. The frames are smaller. In this case I'm using white foundation. But this is where the bees will store their honey. So any honey that's above this level for the 2 hive bodies here, this is honey that we can take off. There's no need to have a hive that has more honey than that. Typically, a hive that is going into the winter this big has enough food to get through just about every Maine winter. Typically, I think that in many cases where people run their hives even bigger going through the winter, they're basically just throwing honey away. They're leaving dollars on the table, as it were. It's not, you can easily get the bees through the winter with a hive this size, and as I'll show you, even smaller. Bees store their food at the top of the hive, so they'll typically fill this hive body up, this medium super up pretty quickly on a good year. So I would say that more than half of beekeepers that start their hive in early May in this area, given typical locations and typical weather, will get their hive to about this size by the fall, by which time we take this super off to extract our honey, and then we get ready for the winter. But that's basically our typical equipment. So we'll close up the hive here, and that's the basic structure of the hive. We'll talk more on other things like tools and beekeeping practices in a future video. Thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. Maybe subscribe to my YouTube channel, or like what you see, and tell your friends about it. This is early days. No doubt I will remake this video at some stage when I'm better at doing what I'm setting out to do here. But I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you're going to learn a lot from it. Thanks very much.